I met Lena on a rainy night, I told Ryan, and she smiled at me like I was the only man alive. Ryan said, "You sound lost, man." I wasn't lost, I said, I was in love. Lena laughed and said, "You talk too much," and I said, "I just want to know your dreams." She whispered, "I want a life where I feel safe," and I answered, "Then I'll be that safety." We stayed up talking and I said, "I see you in my future." She replied, "Don't say that unless you mean it." "I mean it," I said. Ryan later warned me, "Something about her feels wrong." I snapped, "You don't know her like I do." Lena held my hand and said, "Why does your friend hate me?" "He doesn't," I lied, "he just doesn't understand us." She looked at me and said, "Promise you won't leave." I said, "I will protect you no matter what." I noticed small lies and I said, "Why did you change your story?" She smiled and said, "You worry too much." "I trust you," I told her. She kissed me and said, "That's why I love you." Late at night she said, "Do you ever think we'll fall apart?" I replied, "Not if I'm here." She squeezed my hand and whispered, "I need you to promise you'll never leave me." I said, "I promise," even though my heart felt strange. I thought love made me strong, but it quietly made me blind to every warning sign she ever gave to my soul. Police kicked my door and I shouted, "What is happening?" Harris said, "Hands up," and I said, "This is a mistake." I kept yelling, "I didn't do anything," but he replied, "Tell it to the judge." My hands were shaking and I asked, "Where is Lena?" He said, "She gave us everything." I whispered, "No, she wouldn't." Outside I saw her crying and I yelled, "Lena, tell them the truth." She looked at me and said, "I'm sorry." I asked, "For what?" But she turned away. I felt my chest burn and I said, "You did this to me." Harris pushed me and said, "Move." Neighbors stared and I shouted, "I'm innocent." In the car I asked, "Why would she lie?" Harris said, "People protect themselves." I remembered her voice saying, "I'll never hurt you," and I laughed in pain. I said, "She used me." Harris stayed silent. I pressed my head back and whispered, "Everything I loved is gone." I felt the truth hit me like cold steel and I knew the woman I loved had just destroyed me. I said, "Lena, how could you?" And in my mind she answered nothing. I told Harris, "You think this is fair?" And he said, "Life is not fair." I whispered, "She ruined me," and he replied, "You will have to survive." I closed my eyes and said, "I trusted her," and my own voice answered, "You were wrong." I kept breathing and felt every dream breaking inside me. I said nothing else because my heart was empty and my future felt dark, cold, and broken beyond any hope at all. I sat on my bunk when Jake said, "You look broken." I answered, "I trusted the wrong woman." He laughed and said, "People hurt you when they're scared." I asked, "Scared of what?" And he said, "Losing power." I told him, "Lena used my name." He leaned closer and asked, "For money?" I said, "For her stepfather, Mr. Cole." Jake shook his head and said, "That's cold." I whispered, "She chose blood over me." He replied, "Love doesn't survive fear." I closed my eyes and said, "I feel sick." Jake said, "That's betrayal talking." I said, "I feel stupid for believing her." He said, "You wanted to be loved." I said, "I replay her lies every night." Jake asked, "Do you still miss her?" I said, "I miss who I thought she was." He said, "That girl never existed." I stared at the wall and said, "Love made me blind." Jake said, "Now you see." I nodded and said, "I won't beg anymore." He replied, "Good." I clenched my hands and said, "If she ruined my life to save hers, then karma will find her." Jake smiled and said, "It always does." I breathed deep and said, "I just want peace." He answered, "Peace comes after truth." I whispered, "Then I am finally free." My voice shook but my mind felt clear for the first time since she betrayed me. I met Maya and she said, "You look tired." I replied, "I haven't slept since everything fell apart." She said, "Sit and breathe," and I said, "I keep hearing her voice." Maya asked, "Lena?" And I nodded. I told her, "She ruined me." Maya said, "You survived." I said, "I don't want revenge." She asked, "Then what do you want?" I said, "I don't want to be weak." Ryan called and said, "I found records." I asked, "About Mr. Cole?" And he said, "Yes." I told him, "Don't push too hard." Ryan said, "We don't need to." I whispered, "Let the truth speak." Maya said, "That's brave." I replied, "I'm just tired of fighting." Ryan said, Cole's accounts are being frozen. I said, good. He asked, do you feel better? I answered, I feel calm. Maya said, sometimes silence is power. I nodded and said, sometimes justice works best when you do nothing. Ryan said, her world is shaking. I said, I'm not touching it. Maya smiled and said, you're letting karma work. I leaned back and said, for the first time I don't feel trapped. Ryan said, that's because you're free. I closed my eyes and said, maybe love didn't die, it just turned into fire. Maya whispered, fire can heal. I replied, or burn lies away. Ryan called and said, her accounts are frozen. I replied, I expected that. He said, Mr. Cole was arrested, and I whispered, that was coming. Ryan asked, do you feel anything? I said, I feel strange. My phone rang and I said, it's Lena. Ryan said, will you answer? I replied, no, she left a message saying, please talk to me. I said, you already said enough. Ryan told me, she is losing everyone. I asked, is she scared? He said, very. I sat quietly and said, she once watched me suffer. Ryan said, now she is alone. I replied, now she knows how it feels. My chest hurt and I said, I don't hate her. Ryan said, you don't need to. I said, I just don't care. My phone rang again and I said, I won't pick up. Ryan said, that's strength. I whispered, it still hurts. He replied, healing always does. I stared at the screen and said, her perfect life is cracking. Ryan said, and you're still standing. I took a slow breath and said, that's enough for me. I ended the call and told myself, pain and relief can live together. I felt both and did not fight them anymore. Lena stood in front of me and said, please talk to me. I replied, what do you want now? She cried, I lost everything, and I said, you chose that. She said, I loved you, and I answered, love doesn't destroy people, you did. She reached for my arm and said, I was scared. I pulled back and said, you were selfish. She whispered, I never meant to hurt you. I said, you planned it. She said, I miss you. I replied, I don't feel anything. Her eyes shook and she said, you can't just forget us. I said, you erased us. She begged, give me one chance. I told her, you had 1,000. She said, I will do anything. I answered, it's too late. She cried, I'm alone. I said, so was I. She said, I ruined my life. I replied, you ruined mine first. She whispered, I need you. I said, you lost me forever. She fell silent and I turned away. I walked past her and said, this is my goodbye. I felt calm, not angry. I thought, this is my real revenge. I kept walking and didn't look back. My heart finally felt free from her shadow and my future felt like it was starting over without fear. I sat across from Dr. Evelyn and said, I still hear her voice. She replied, what does it tell you? I said, that I was not enough. She asked, do you believe that? I answered, not anymore. She smiled and said, then you are healing. I told her, Lena didn't break me. She said, what did she do? I replied, she showed me my strength. Dr. Evelyn nodded and said, that's growth. I said, Maya believes in me. She replied, do you believe in yourself? I said, I'm learning. Dr. Evelyn said, that's how life starts again. I took a breath and said, I don't need revenge. She said, what do you need? I answered, peace. She smiled and said, you found it. I thought about Maya and whispered, I can love again. Dr. Evelyn said, and that scares you. I replied, but it also excites me. She said, that means you survived. I nodded and said, she turned my love into regret. Dr. Evelyn waited and I finished, but she never took my future. I left her office feeling lighter. I walked into the sunlight and said to myself, I am still here, and for the first time I believed it completely.